Hi, I'm Candice Malcolm, and this is the Candice Malcolm Show. Today, on today's episode, I want to talk about the politicization of terrorism that happens in this country. I'm talking, of course, about this absolutely horrific attack that took place on Sunday evening in London, Ontario, where a driver drove his truck into a family, killing 4 people, including a 15-year-old girl, and leaving a 9-year-old boy in hospital in critical condition, while his entire family is dead. It is absolutely gruesome. London police have said this attack was premeditated and deliberate, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has said that this is an act of terrorism, as the family was Muslim and they were dressed in Islamic clothing. Now, this is absolutely a horrible story. There's nothing worse in my mind, absolutely nothing worse than the killing of children, especially in Canada, especially Canadian children. And look, I'm generally opposed to the death penalty. I don't think that the government should have that kind of power. But in cases like this, I think it's just absolutely despicable when it comes to killing kids. I think that we should just throw the book at this despicable man, that we should lock him up and throw away the key. I don't care about any of the other circumstances. It's just absolutely appalling. And what we're seeing in response is just an absolute outpouring of support for this community, of love, of compassion, of solidarity. Canadians are rightly upset and angry that this would happen in our country. We want to make sure that newcomers and that all Canadians feel safe in our communities and feel welcome. We especially want new Canadians and newcomers to know that one deranged young man who committed an evil act does not represent the broader Canadian community. In fact, the broader Canadian community loathes this man and is completely against him. Whatever his motivation, it doesn't matter. His act was evil, it was abhorrent, and it was despicable. Canadians universally condemn murder, and we universally condemn crimes that seem to be motivated by anti-religious bigotry. Full stop. But that is not what I want to talk about on the program today. What I want to talk about is the reaction, what we're seeing in the media and by politicians, specifically on the left, and how they are reacting to this despicable attack. So almost immediately after the news came out and the details were learned, the left-wing media pounced, and they started declaring that conservative politicians and conservative media were to blame. Now, what many in the media and many politicians started pointing to was something called M103, which was a 2017 Liberal motion which sought to condemn Islamophobia, and conservatives by and large voted against it. There was just one conservative who voted for it, and that was Michael Chong. Now, this is what the Toronto Star wrote in their story about this attack. As politicians across Canada express their sadness over this weekend's fatal attack on a Muslim family in London, Ontario, community leaders are asking some of them to explain why they opposed a federal, non-binding motion condemning Islamophobia in 2017, and to explain their apparent change in position. Okay, there's a lot wrong with this statement, and so since everyone's talking about M103, I think it's worthwhile to go through what the actual issue was when it came to that motion, why conservatives were against it, and to the Toronto Star, there hasn't been an apparent change in position. You can show sympathy for a Muslim family that was killed, and you can condemn it, and you can find it abhorrent without wanting to get into the political debate about the term Islamophobia. And that was what it was. It was a politicized debate about that one word Islamophobia. And it's also worth noting that the Liberals at the time were deliberately creating a wedge issue, and the media, being the media, completely misrepresented what the issue actually was and why conservatives didn't vote in favor of it. So at the time, many conservative MPs, as well as conservative commentators, myself included, opposed the language in the motion that term Islamophobia was never defined, and that was a problem, and it was intentional. They intentionally did not define that word. The word itself is obviously very controversial. It was very politicized, and to many, the word doesn't mean bigotry or hate or an irrational fear of Muslims. It means criticizing Islam. It means that the religion and the political doctrine are sort of out of bounds in terms of criticism, which is the case in most Muslim countries in the world. So Raheel Raza, who is a Canadian activist and the founder of the moderate Muslim group Muslims Facing Tomorrow, she said this about the term. She said, The term Islamophobia was coined after 9/11. You don't have to take my word on it. It's all electronically available by an operative of the Muslim Brotherhood, who actually said, and is quoted to having said, that they would throw this term out there so that there is no questioning, criticism, or any kind of discussion about Islam and Muslims. So Rahil Raza was just one of countless Canadian Muslims who opposed M103. Tariq Fatah, another one, he's my colleague over at the Toronto Sun. He says, quote, I hope to make the MPs realize that if they include the word denouncing Islamophobia in their proposals, they will infringe on the inalienable right of Muslim Canadians to critique their own religion, as has been the rich tradition that has been stifled by mullahs, kings, and caliphs by murdering us. Fatah was one of the organizers of a group called Muslims Against M103. They hosted an event that was attended by several high-profile Muslim activists. Rahil Raza, who was also there, said this, we are entrapped by the use of the term Islamophobia, which is not clearly defined. As I read and reread the text of the motion M103, I can agree with the overall intent, but without the use of the term, because Islamophobia can and has been used to confuse the masses and stifle free speech. So conservative MPs were taking their lead from these Muslim activists, and they therefore opposed the term Islamophobia, but not necessarily the intent behind the motion, and that was why conservative MP Scott Reid simply asked the Liberals to remove the controversial term Islamophobia and instead replace it with the more concise term anti-Muslim bigotry. And if they would have done that, the Conservatives would have been happy to support the motion, but they didn't because they were trying to create a wedge issue. This was all politicized. They kept in that controversial word, knowing that Conservatives would be against it, and knowing that they could use that to repeat the lie that Conservatives are bigots, and of course the media, being the media, are all too happy to play along, play dumb, and repeat that idea that Conservatives didn't condemn Islamophobia because they're just bigots, and that's that. That's that, and that's what the media decided to run with. And then, again, we're seeing it this week in the aftermath of this attack, repeating the same lie that the Conservatives didn't support that one motion because they are bigots. And now it really doesn't help, by the way, when conservative politicians are suddenly more than happy now to use this politicized term Islamophobia, which we've seen this week from conservative leader Erin O'Toole. What they're really doing is validating the left-wing narrative that they have had a change of heart, or that the conservative position somehow in the past was wrong, that it was rooted in bigotry. That really doesn't help anything to go back and say, hey, efforts like the niqab ban, efforts like creating a hotline to help abused children who are the victims of cultural violence, like honor killings, that creating resources to help them really just stems from dog whistle politics or anti-Islamic bigotry. The reality is that those efforts are taken to do community outreach. Most of them came from requests from within the Muslim community, and that was why they had those kind of efforts, not because there was some kind of hatred. So when the Conservatives concede and say that, yes, we were bigoted in the past, all they're doing is seeking strange new respect from the media, and they end up validating the unfair characterizations pushed by the left-wing media and also throw fellow conservatives under the bus. And speaking of throwing fellow conservatives under the bus, there's another narrative coming out of this attack, which we've seen so much in recent weeks. Anytime there's any kind of a big news story, we fall back on this same narrative that Canadians, by and large, are horrible, racist people. We've seen it left, right, and center in the past few months and years, this idea that all Canadians are somehow racist. So we had a conservative out in London validating that. Jeff Bennett, who is a 2014 candidate for the Ontario PC Party in London West, he unleashed a tirade on Facebook condemning the City of London, Ontario as racist. This is what he said. Now, I see people expressing shock that a racist terrorist would drive his truck into the pathway of a Muslim family going for a walk. London is better than this, they say. I can't believe this happened here. Bull S, he says. I won't say the word, but bull S. I knocked on thousands of doors in the very neighborhood this atrocity occurred. The terrorist may have been alone in that truck on that day, but he was not acting alone. He was raised in a racist city that pretends it isn't. Now, of course, the left-wing media is applauding this individual as brave and courageous for turning on conservatives and saying the same thing that the left says about the country, which is that we're all horrible racists. You know, it's a really funny thing. If you're a conservative and you suddenly want the respect of the media, All you have to do is throw your side under the bus and repeat the very worst accusations about conservatives and about all Canadians. And then all of a sudden, suddenly you're a star in the media. So I hate seeing that. Obviously, there are racist people out there. I'm not saying there aren't, but the classification that this was all done. But the idea that all Canadians are racist is just nonsense. You can see that now by the outpouring of love and support for Muslims in the aftermath. If Canadians were truly these awful racist people, you wouldn't see that. You would see people, being indifferent or celebrating, which really you're not seeing that other than maybe in the darkest quarters of the internet. It's just not happening. By and large, Canadians are good people, good-hearted, and they're not racist. Now, it's really unfortunate that this PC candidate was trying to blame the broader community in London, saying that this stemmed from a group of people, that it wasn't just one individual in the car, it was everybody. That's basically the opposite of what we're usually told. When it came to the Danforth shooter who unleashed his deadly rampage in Toronto, he killed a small child and a teenage girl, we literally heard the opposite. Even after ISIS took responsibility, even after we learned that this individual attended a radical Muslim mosque, and even after it came out that his parents had told two different stories. His mom and his dad said opposite things when it came to his mental health background, as well as the stories about where he had traveled to and whether he had gone to terrorist hotspots. We heard different stories. None of that mattered. What the media said was, A, don't blame the broader community. This was an individual act. 2, he was acting out of mental illness. Don't look at his background or his ideology. Those had nothing to do with the attack. It was only mental illness, nothing to do with his ideology. The media told us not to call it terrorism. They said that would be playing into what ISIS wants. And finally, the police initially refused to name the perpetrator, and the media were not showing pictures. They refused to show pictures of this individual. Well, this is kind of the opposite of what we are seeing now. We're seeing blame the entire community. We instantly call it terrorism. The police named the individual right away and said it was deliberate. Media were posting pictures of this guy, not just now as a 20-year-old, but finding pictures of him when he was a teenager. There was one image of him when he was like 15 years old, and no one's talking about whether or not he was mentally ill, and everyone's saying that he must be a right-wing extremist and that he must have been influenced by conservative media and conservative politicians. And who can forget, in the instance of that Danforth killer, the media actually urged Canadians to embrace the killer's family and to reach out and support them. Of course, none of that's happening with the media right now. The left-wing media is more than happy to politicize this tragedy. They're more than happy to use it as a club to beat conservatives. Look, this country is heading in a very dangerous direction, and the Liberal government is more than happy to take advantage of a gruesome attack to push their own radical agenda. They did this exact same thing last year after the massacre in Nova Scotia. They used the emotion and the fear of that attack to push through sweeping legislation to ban legal firearms, and I'm sure they'll do it again if we let them. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Candice Malcolm, and this has been The Candice Malcolm Show.